There are things that look as if nothing is left in them, and that is precisely why we stop noticing them. Ash is one of those things. A gray powder after fire, a trace of what has already happened, a reminder of warmth that is no longer there. Today it is swept away without a second thought, carried out and thrown away, as if it has nothing to do with life. But if that were true, ash would not have been known for millennia. It would not have been preserved, talked about, and certainly not used in situations where the result determined harvests and the survival of entire families. And this is where something strange begins. Because in old farmers' stories, in the memories of people who grew up close to the land, ash appears not as waste, but as something treated with attention and even caution. It was said that plants do not respond to it immediately, but if everything is done correctly, they seem to change. The leaves become denser to the touch, the color looks deeper. Growth becomes steadier, without sharp spurts, as if the roots begin to work with greater confidence. These observations did not look like a miracle. Rather, they were a recurring result noticed again and again in different places and at different times. It is important to understand that no one explained this back then in complex terms. People simply saw the connection. They saw that soil behaved differently after ash was added. It stopped being tired, became more alive, absorbed moisture better, and released nutrients to plants more easily. And this was what made people treat ash not as a remnant of fire, but as something that had not yet finished its work. Interestingly, ash was used almost everywhere people lived alongside fire. In Europe, it was collected after cleaning stoves. In North America, it was mentioned by settlers working with new, challenging soils. In Asia, ash was part of everyday agricultural life long before the appearance of industrial fertilizers. Different cultures, different languages, different traditions, but the same observation. If ash is not rushed and is handled correctly, the land responds. And here the first truly surprising point appears, one that is rarely spoken about today. Fresh ash was deliberately not used right away. It was described as too harsh, too strong. It was believed that in this state it could harm plants, burn roots, and disrupt the balance of the soil. So the ash was left to rest. Sometimes it was mixed with water. Sometimes it was simply allowed to sit. Sometimes people waited for it to change on its own. They said the ash needed to calm down, soften, mature. These words sound simple, but behind them was a deep understanding of processes that people did not try to speed up, but allowed to unfold naturally. Over time, people noticed that such ash stopped being aggressive. It began to work differently. Plants near it looked more resilient, tolerated drought better, and recovered faster from cold or damage. Of course, no grand conclusions were announced, but farmers saw the difference and passed this knowledge on, not through books, but through experience and observation. Another interesting fact often mentioned in old sources is that ash was never considered a standalone solution. It was not called magical. It was used as part of a system, as support for the soil, not a replacement for everything else. And that was exactly what made the method sustainable. Ash did not break natural processes. It gently integrated into them. This is especially important to understand today because the modern view of fertilizers is often built around quick results. But old methods worked differently. They were slower, but deeper. They did not force plants to grow. They helped the soil create conditions in which growth became natural. And perhaps the most striking point is that this knowledge never disappeared completely. It simply slipped into the shadows. It stopped being passed on because it required time, attentiveness, and patience. And in a world of fast solutions, such things seem inconvenient. But the land does not forget them. Sometimes this knowledge returns through accidental experiments by gardeners, sometimes through the memories of older generations, sometimes through practices preserved in certain regions, and each time people note the same thing. It is not about the ash itself, but about how it is handled. because ash is not just residue. It is what remains of a tree that for years drew minerals, moisture, and strength from the earth. And when fire releases all of this, the only question is whether a person will allow nature to complete the process or try to use the result too early. People realized fairly early on one simple thing: fresh ash behaves too aggressively. It could burn the soil, disrupt growth, and make the ground hard and compacted. This was noticed more than once and in more than one place, which is why ash was almost never used immediately. This was not superstition. It was the result of observation. Over time, farmers discovered that ash left in a moist environment changes. It stops irritating the soil and begins to behave differently. It was said that after this resting period, plants stop resisting. Roots enter the soil more easily, leaves become denser, and growth proceeds more evenly. These effects were not immediate, but they occurred often enough for the method to continue being used. The main benefit of ash most often mentioned was that it returned to the soil what plants had once taken from it. A tree grew for years, accumulating minerals. Then fire released them, and humans returned them to the earth, but in a different form. This made ash a valuable material, rather than just a remnant of fire. It was also noted separately that properly prepared ash helped the soil manage moisture more effectively. The ground became less compact, absorbed water more quickly, and retained it for longer. During dry periods, plants growing in such soil appeared more resilient, and after heavy rains, their roots were less likely to suffer from waterlogging. These observations made ash especially valuable in difficult climatic conditions. Another important point frequently mentioned in old sources is the effect of ash on soil acidity. People did not call it that, but they noticed that ash could soften the soil, especially in places where plants had previously grown poorly. At the same time, caution was always emphasized. Too much ash could produce the opposite effect. For this reason, it was used sparingly and infrequently as a corrective tool rather than a primary source of nutrition. Interestingly, ash was often combined with organic materials. Manure, compost, plant residues, all of these worked better in the presence of ash, which, according to farmers' observations, ускоряло процессы разложения и делало питание более доступным для растений. In such soils, growth began faster while remaining stable. It is important to emphasize that this method was never considered universal. In some places, it worked noticeably better. In others, it required caution or was not used at all. This is why knowledge about ash was always passed on together with the recommendation to observe the soil and plants rather than blindly repeat actions. Over time, with the arrival of fast solutions and standardized schemes, this approach began to seem too complex. It required attention, patience, and an understanding of conditions. It could not be reduced to a single instruction, and that is precisely why it was displaced by simpler but less flexible methods. Today, interest in this approach is returning not because of nostalgia for the past, but because of practice. People are once again noticing that the soil is tired, that plants respond better to gentle, well-considered interventions than to harsh stimuli. And ash, having completed its journey from fire to earth, once again finds itself at the center of attention, not as a miracle, but as a tool that works when one understands why and how to use it. When people first try working with ash, they almost always make the same mistake. They treat it like an ordinary fertilizer. They sprinkle it, water it, and wait for quick results. And that's exactly when the method starts to work against them. Ash is not about more, it's about precise, and that fundamentally changes everything. The most common mistake is using fresh, unprepared ash directly. It seems logical, after all, it contains the necessary elements, but in practice, plants often respond with stress. Leaves may lose color, growth slows, and the root zone becomes less active. People get discouraged and conclude that the method doesn't work, when in fact the problem isn't the ash, but the approach. The second mistake is a lack of moderation. old descriptions constantly emphasized caution. Ash was never applied by eye. It was used in small portions, observing how the soil and plants responded. Ash was considered a corrective, not the foundation of nutrition. When this principle was ignored, the balance was quickly lost. The third mistake is using the wrong source. Not all ash is the same, and this was understood long before laboratories existed. Only ash from clean wood, without additives, paints, or treatments, was used. It was believed that everything contained in the tree would transfer to the soil. Therefore, the fuel source was treated with the same care as seeds or water. There is also a less obvious mistake, expecting an instant miracle. Yes, changes can sometimes be noticed quickly, but the main strength of this method lies in stability. The soil becomes more predictable, and plants respond more evenly, without sudden spikes. This is not a wow overnight effect, but a seasonal effect that unfolds differently than usual. Historically, ash was most often applied in liquid form or combined with organic matter. In this form, it interacted more gently with the soil and roots. It was said that water helps ash negotiate with the earth, while organic matter serves as a mediator between minerals and the living processes in the soil. That is why ash was rarely used on its own. A notable observation frequently mentioned in farmers' records is that ash performed especially well on depleted plots. Where soil had been used for a long time without restoration, plants responded more noticeably. This did not mean that ash heals the soil, but it clearly helped trigger processes that had long been suppressed. Interestingly, ash was rarely applied repeatedly in quick succession. Pauses were taken, the behavior of the plot was observed, and only then was a decision made about reapplication. This approach required attention, but it was precisely what allowed farmers to avoid imbalance and maintain long-term effects. There is one more point that is rarely mentioned today, but frequently appears in old accounts. Ash amplifies what is already present. If the soil is alive, well-tended, and rich in organic matter, the effect is noticeable and positive. If the soil is dead, depleted, and compacted, ash may produce weak or unstable results. This is not a flaw in the method, it is its honesty. That is why this approach never became widespread. It requires thought, observation, and respect for the process. It cannot be automated or reduced to a single instruction for everyone, and that is both its strength and its limitation. Today, as many people are once again seeking sustainable and understandable solutions, ash returns, not as a trendy fad, but as a reminder. People used to work not against nature, but with it. They did not chase quick results at any cost. They sought balance. And if you approach this method in the same way, without fanaticism, without haste, with attention to detail, it ceases to be a forgotten recipe and becomes a practical tool. Simple, accessible, and honest. Perhaps most importantly, ash does not teach you how to grow a plant faster, but how to better understand the soil. And when that understanding emerges, many problems are solved before they even have a chance to appear.